On this episode of Civic Cocktail, are Seattle's liberal roots spreading farther to the left?
Urban values are more closely aligned with liberal values.
We haven't built a city for all human beings, which is why it's hard for me to think that Seattle's actually truly liberal.
The issue will be who the beneficiaries are in the long run, but it has shifted already.
Also, DACA's uncertain future. Hear from one man fighting for it.
These folks did not do anything wrong. They're contributing enormously to the community. It doesn't make any sense to deport them.
Another who fears its demise.
I'm not leaving voluntarily, no.
It's all coming up on Civic Cocktail.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to another great season of Civic Cocktail. I'm Joni Balter here this evening to talk about Seattle's shift to the political left. And who better to discuss that with than Nikkita Oliver of the Seattle People's Party, Ron Sims, former King County executive and former Deputy Secretary of HUD, and Tim Keck, publisher of The Stranger. He's becoming a frequent flyer here, aren't you, Tim? Our journalists helping with the questions this evening, Liz Jones from KUOW and Knut Berger from crosscut.com. Okay, let's start by defining what we're actually talking about here. Ron Sims, you've been around for a little while, and I want to know if you think Seattle really has shifted left, and if so, how?
It's clearly shifted politically left.
Yes,
and
that is the point.
And there are a number of policies that are embodied by the left. The issue will be who the beneficiaries are in the long run, but it has shifted already.
And so, give me an example of how
People of color are leaving the area because there are policies, and so Seattle will lose over time populations of color. So
Are they leaving
than San
because
Francisco.
of the policies? Are they leaving because of prices? Or
The
how
issues,
is this?
it doesn't address some underlying issues like income disparities that always exist. And so as a result, if you are looking for equity formation, you'll do that outside of Seattle. That's what people of color are doing, because it's not going to be able to, something that's being addressed internally within Seattle. San Francisco has the same problem. Most cities have done, cities that do the left, not everybody wins. There are winners and losers tend to be poor people and people of color.
So Tim Keck, you and I had a discussion about this. I pre-meet with the guests sometimes. What ways can we measure? Is this, how do we tell that we actually did, quote, shift politically left? Or is this just a stranger conspiracy theory?
Well, you can see who people who we've elected. On city council, the chances of having a Republican on city council are pretty much nil, but having a socialist exists,
kind of the thing,
right? You'd see somebody much more like Nikkita Oliver as mayor than a Mark Sidran, for instance. And so our elected officials, and then social aspects as far as legalization of marijuana, gay marriage, those kind of things had a big movement out of Seattle, and those kind of things are, you feel like, and also you can tell that Seattle is moving more to the left because we're a successful growing city. And that, I think that's part of why the city is successful.
Would you elaborate on that? Because one thing that you had said was you think that cities are natural places where people become more liberal.
Absolutely. Well, liberal politics has more tools at its disposal to fit an urban life. Urban values are more closely aligned with liberal values. If you live in a city, you're much more likely to care about your police, your fire department, transportation, those kind of things. You're much more likely to have higher quality elected officials. In a small town, you might elect somebody like Donald Trump. But you would no urban area in America would ever elect somebody like Donald Trump on city council because he's incompetent, right? But the cities demand more of their politics, and that's why liberals do well.
Nikkita, you are part of the Seattle People's Party. You recently, everyone in the room knows, did very well in the mayoral primary back in August. And I know we got some folks here. What is the prime issue for the left in this city? Prime issues, we're okay too.
Prime issues. Honestly, I actually think the prime issue facing the left is not much different than the prime issue facing the right, quote unquote, because I actually think those distinctions are really problematic. But What I would say is it's the lack of ability to create nuance. Both the left and the right are held to ideologies that don't necessarily meet the needs of people who most need their needs met. I think traditionally, using some of what Tim was saying, we're using the fact that we have a socialist city council member as a measurement. But Seattle as a whole doesn't function on socialism. We're not meeting the needs of everyone within our city. We could also talk about the metric of growth. Who's growing in Seattle? Well, we've already talked about people of color being pushed out. It's really white and wealthy people that are benefiting in Seattle. And so I would actually, say it is our lack of ability to have nuance around human need, but also the ecology and environment of the planet that actually shows that Seattle's not moving left in the application of being on the left, but maybe just in word.
So one area that it may be moving left is in the area of endorsements from newspapers. And Tim, I asked you almost the same question the last time you were on here, so forgive me. But I think of this as, so in the old days, the endorsements for politicians who would run on be city council or mayor, it was the Seattle Times and the PI, and the Stranger sort of said a bunch of fun stuff, and that was it. The PI went down at one point quite significantly, and it sort of opened up room for upstarts like the Stranger. And I'm thinking of the year, maybe this is the right date, and I'd love to hear what you think about this. I'm thinking of the year 2009, which was the year the Stranger put Mike McGinn, not only endorsed him, but put him on the cover. So all the boxes in town, wherever you went, Mike McGinn. Is that the turning point or part of the turning point to the left where you guys rose up and that's part of what's driving this?
I think I don't think that we built the left in Seattle. I think we were filling a void and a need that was there. I don't think the Stranger is the creator of moving the city towards the left. I think the city was already getting more left than the politics existed. During that time, right before that was Mark Sidron's time, right? And so that's I don't think it's nice to say, and sure I'd like to take. To say the Stranger is responsible for it, but I don't think that's true. I think Seattle, if the Stranger disappeared tomorrow, and many people wish that would be the case, we would continue being, the city would continue going farther toward the left.
Ron, is Seattle more left? You hinted at this, but is Seattle more left than many other major cities? Tim makes the argument that cities are by definition more liberal.
I think Tim's right. Most urban areas are fairly liberal, fairly to the left on a variety of issues. Inclusivity, respect for the dignity of everyone. They also fail in the same way, which is their inability to address some basic needs that are needed. How do you ensure that every neighborhood works is important? How do you ensure that you're reducing the health impacts that we know exist by neighborhood design? So there's some things that they do really well and some things they don't. The real challenge, and it reminds me of San Francisco, is how do you get a region to function really well? So if you look at what happened in San Francisco—
Sounds like a county executive talking.
Well, yeah. Still no, I'm retired, I love it. But the real issue is that East Bay actually really transformed itself. It had to meet the needs of the liberals who could no longer live in San Francisco, so it reformatted itself. And you can see that in Berkeley and in Oakland and other places. And I think that the challenge that Seattle will face in the long run is how do you influence the Auburns and the Kents and the Rentons and the Bellevues and the Mercer Islands and some of the cities, Bothell and Berrien. How do you influence their growth? Because the populations that are moving here are going to look for housing, especially if you have kids, you're going to want acres of it. Any grandkids, you want multiple acres of it. And I think the real challenge that Seattle will face is, are you a destination for employment only? And you can say we're strikingly liberal because we have wealthy people here and we're liberal. Or is it going to be something that can be translated as a benefit economically and socially to the areas that we call suburbs? So if you look at the whole area as a metropolitan community, that will be the challenge Seattle faces. It won't be just this jurisdiction standing alone. It'll be how does this really improve the quality of life at a broader level? And that's the other, and most of the people live in that other area.
So speaking of the region, Nikkita, you know, there was a time when King County had a Republican King County executive. There was a time when there were Republicans on the Seattle City Council. Is there still room in Seattle for Republicans to serve in our government?
I mean, there's always room. That comes down to voting, right? Like, who does Seattle want to vote for? And if we're talking about Seattle as liberal because we vote for folks like Shama Sawant, I suppose that's a fair metric. But in reality, Seattle is not liberal if we talk about actual social justice or law and application, how it actually unfolds. This isn't about Republicans and Democrats or liberals versus conservatives for me. It's really about human beings. And we haven't built a city for all human beings, which is why it's hard for me to think that Seattle's actually truly liberal. I'll give you an example. We voted for, the city council passed the Fair Housing Ordinance, which is great. That means folks who have criminal records now have some protection to ensure that they get housing. But if you look at like the neighborhood blogs, where a lot of not so liberal conversations go down, in my opinion, where landlords are actually telling each other how they can look at whether or not a person has some sort of employment gap or a housing gap. And that's translating into finding ways around this Fair Housing Ordinance, which is supposed to ensure that people are able to find housing in Seattle. That is if they can afford it. And so what does liberal really mean? I mean, it's a very nice label, and I think a lot of wealthy white Seattleites feel great living in this city, but in reality, if we dig into who has the right to stay here in this place, it is not the Native folks, it is not the Black folks, it is not queer and trans folks who have lived on Capitol Hill for a long time and made it what it is. And that makes me question whether or not we're moving left in deed or just in policy. So to go back to your question, is there room for Republicans? Absolutely, but the question is, will Seattle vote for them? And I would also ask, are we really voting for that liberal of Democrats? And if you look at this last mayoral election, we're in a nonpartisan office. Even our legislative districts felt held to have to go with their political party to endorse someone, even when their own constituency was saying they wanted to endorse other candidates. It's hard to think of us as liberal in the sense of really making strides towards social justice policies.
So George Will wrote a column last week, and he was taking Seattle to task for either cherry-picking arguments or being hypocrites, basically. His argument was that when we passed the sugar tax, the beverage tax, that we had in our minds that we were going to change behavior. We were going to raise this tax so that people would, you know, drink less of sugary beverages. But then with the minimum, when we raised the minimum wage, raising the price of labor, we were suddenly like, well, we don't expect that to have a behavior change. We expect people to still be employed. Jump ball, does anyone have a thought about that possible hypocrisy that was pointed out?
That we're, by raising the minimum wage, we're...
That we don't expect anybody's behavior to change. You know, that we did it with this, you know, whatever happens, happens.
Well, I haven't read that article, but one of the important things about raising the minimum wage is that people take that money and then spend it in their community, right? And so that raising the minimum wage isn't trying to prevent people from obesity or other issues. It's a specific, it's an economic goal, and if more people get paid more money, they'll spend more money and the economy does well. In Seattle, for instance, if we hadn't raised the wage to $15, wages probably would have been going up already. You know, if you talk to most businesses, the wages are, except for on the very low end. And those folks on the very low end would be so much more priced out of the city. It wouldn't affect the economy, it wouldn't hurt job growth. We have amazing job growth in town. What we want to do is have the government step in and put some limits to how low people can get paid so it helps the economy as a whole. Same with housing. The government should step in and help with the housing problems. Same with transportation, police, those kind of things.
I'm going to bring the journalists in here.
Well, so the last Seattle mayor who went on to higher office was in 1940. The rest of the state, Ron, you mentioned the region, certainly Eastern Washington, thinks we're arrogant, selfish, socialists, basically, and maybe crazy. I know a candidate who's running for office in King County and was asking people door to door what to do about the homeless issue, and the answer was consistently the opposite of whatever Seattle's doing. if we're talking about greater regional cooperation, and this is for the panel, what can we do to repair or the Seattle political brand in the region?
You know, I think it really, so I was on John Carlson's show, and he opened it up with letting me know that they're like 1 out of 9 voters are Republicans, and you have to talk to them. And he's right. I think part of the struggle is, and this goes back to my point about nuance, is when the left or the right becomes so committed to their ideologies and only their constituency, we begin to build a gulf. And in a state like Washington, that where most of the state actually does not look like Seattle, that gulf can quickly become a chasm when we're not willing to understand that there are felt needs of other places across the state or also in other regions. Does that mean we shouldn't do what we're doing? I don't think that's the case, but I do think it's about organizing. I'm an organizer. So at the end of the day, I know that if I want to get any movement in the city, it's not just about disruption and agitation. It's also about figuring out who are the other stakeholders in the city and why would the movement that we're asking for actually be important to them as well. I think at the state level, that's exactly the same. So thinking about the income tax and the fact that our state as a whole has an incredibly regressive tax system. That's not something Seattle will ever be able to change on its own. It's going to require the coalition of other cities, and it's going to require that we get to the other side of the state. There are people on that side of the state for whom a progressive tax structure would benefit them. The problem is Seattle as a city does tend to try to hog resources because we think that because we have more people and we have more needs, that our needs supersede those of the rest of the state. And it would be about figuring out how do you also prioritize the needs of other areas in the state so those areas of the state want to work with us as a stakeholder.
I think that's wrong. First of all, Seattle puts in a lot more tax revenue per person than it takes, whereas the rest of the state, the rest of the state takes more. So when somebody says like the socialist monsters in Seattle and anything but Seattle, I'd like to see how they feel we're doing so poorly. How is it this city is doing so poorly in their terms and in their eyes, and how much we spend on, how much money we put into the system and how much they take. Their roads are a lot more expensive than our mass transit.
Maybe we should put Tim on the journalist panel over here.
Is that true, though? That, I mean, look at how ST3 went down and the impact that will have for us as a region. But when you go to places like Yakima or Spokane and you look at the immense amount of needs that we're seeing amongst our farm workers, amongst people of color in those areas, regardless of whether or not it costs more to build those roads over people, there are people there who need lots of resources, and there has to be a way for us as a city to not just simply prioritize our needs and say because we put in more we should get out more. That doesn't even make sense with the idea of us being leftist. Like the left would say we prioritize human beings
that's precisely
as a whole
what we're
across.
doing.
But we're prioritizing our human beings.
Here. Years ago, I used to go down to Olympia, and all these legislators would say they're giving Seattle and King County too much money. So I said, oh, I got a great idea. Why don't we'll just keep our revenues? And then the conversation changed because Seattle, King County are exporters. That's just a fact of revenues. The real issue is, as long as we continue to say everything is Seattle and not the metropolitan area, we fail. You can't do that anymore. You can't drive on any road here and say that all of a sudden that we're not, whether it's coming from Tacoma, which is a pain in the neck at any time, day or night, trying to get up here, whether it is coming down from Snohomish County, the area is a metropolitan area, and the real issue will be what will be the character of that metropolitan area, and we don't want to address it. We keep thinking Seattle's an island. Seattle can't possibly be an island because there are more people who live outside it than in it. And the issue is, what will this whole area look and thrive like? There aren't many metropolitan areas that work well at the moment because they tend to have their old habits. Interesting thing is Minneapolis-St. Paul is actually trying to work on a different concept of how you organize urban areas and metropolitan areas so that you have two cities totally distinct, trust me. And yet, you know, their mayors, their business community, their refugee groups, their immigrant groups are all trying to say, we have to have a look and feel for an entire metropolitan area, and are now trying to put in place the planning mechanisms so that you'll see an implementation of a metropolitan area, even though we may have several governments within it. We are doing what everybody does when they're a big city. They get big, and they get big, and they get big, and they get big, and then all of a sudden you find out that if you're young, or if you have families, you're out of here.
Liz Jones.
Yeah, this is for Ron Sims also, and you're kind of globally talking about a question that I had. Something that sort of echoed a lot after the presidential election was this notion of the pendulum always swings. Yeah. Well, maybe in Seattle, it kind of like there's some gravitational force that keeps it to the left. But I'm wondering, what do you see as a potential issue or type of issue that would maybe force things back another way? And do you see any indication of movement in that direction?
I mean, other than a major earthquake? Just joking, just joking. No.
I was just in Mexico City, so too soon.
I can't think of any one issue we'll define. It'll be a whole series of issues. Seattle's going to be, its employment base will be commuters. And I don't think that we have actually made that kind of substantial investment both to control the flow and put the infrastructure in for it. That'll be one. What I more worry about is the inefficiencies now within Seattle's own infrastructure, and whether or not people choose to move their businesses, and particularly if they depend upon people getting to work quickly or moving goods and services outside of Seattle. So Seattle may become a place where you have you'll have a lot of wealthy people living here in very expensive housing. Whether or not it will be a typical city in the long run, I don't believe it. It reminds me of downtown New York. You know, you don't say, wow, New York City, wow. You say New York City. You don't say to Chicago, wow, I just want to live in Chicago. It's the metropolitan area that people have escaped to. That's where the quality of life is.
I want to jump in here because I don't want to finish this segment. We're running out of time a little bit without talking about Amazon and the decision to build a second headquarters somewhere, but supposedly definitely not Seattle. Tim Keck, is Seattle too lefty now for business investment? I mean, there was
Absolutely not. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, well, there was somebody who said it's never.
Next question.
There was we can work this out. Yeah. There was someone, a business leader, who said it's never too late to say we're sorry. Should we say we're sorry?
Yeah, I think that's a ridiculous position that person had. First of all, if we're worrying about businesses, I think small businesses is what Seattle should be worrying about. We shouldn't be worrying so much about Amazon. Amazon succeeded here precisely because Seattle's a great city, and they grew here with with education and roads and all the things that the city has brought to it. Amazon's not going to move to they're not going to move to they're not going to go to the suburbs. They're not going to be in a rural area. They're going to go into a liberal city, and they're going to profit off the values and the riches of a liberal city. And I think that this whole notion that we haven't done enough for Amazon is ridiculous. I think we did a huge amount for Amazon, and I think one of the reasons why Amazon did so well.
Does anyone think we did too much?
I'm sorry?
Does anyone think we did too much?
Did too much?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think they should. I think that we should have an income tax, and people who make a lot of money should be taxed so we can pay for things.
So Nikkita, I want to get to one other topic here, and that is one of the candidates for mayor has flirted with the idea of a right to shelter for homeless folks, even also bringing up again this week the idea that the homeless should have access to the parks until we settle to find a way to house them. What do you think of those two ideas?
I 100% agree. Housing is a human right. We live in a city that has allowed businesses like Amazon to make the city its playground, and we haven't taken strides to put in an income tax or impact fees or the sorts of things that will allow us to build housing at a fast enough rate.
The city council certainly tried.
They did try. I mean, but it goes back to that regional question. There is an actual law that prevents it from existing. So we need to have been thinking about a progressive income tax 10 years ago. But I think when we talk about a right to housing, it really is, this is one of the issues that shows us how far left Seattle is not. because we've known that we were in a housing crisis for nearly 4 years and yet have failed to put the things in place that actually would allow us to ensure that folks had places to live.
Still trying to measure this leftward shift here. Ron and Tim, what was your most left idea a decade ago or 5 years ago?
You first,
Help
Ron.
each other. You're both friends. Help each other.
Soft serve ice cream out of a hovercraft.
I don't think that was it.
Like a lot of the things that we argued for and have, fought for, legalization of marijuana, gay marriage, some of those more
Statewide,
social
though,
aspects
they happen
have
statewide.
happened,
Yeah.
right? And I think that the dream of having an income tax continues.
What's yours?
I was an income tax proponent and unapologetic about it. I think that we have an antiquated system. I have never understood understood our tax structure. Most reasonable people don't. But leftists, gollies, we legalize so much stuff. I mean, it was like
personal, huh?
No, I was just trying to figure out what we didn't do that was leftist. It was kind of instinctive. It was really interesting. One of the things that I've never raised was that Seattle segregated and remains so today, statistically. And so we never resolved that issue. And if I had any failure, it would have been that the metropolitan area began, you had your Renton and your other cities that were having a really interesting demographic change, but Seattle still by neighborhood was defining itself as north and south. It was called north of the canal, south of the canal. And I really wish I had been able to either through lobbying or housing or transportation, get a what we call the north-south split of the canal resolved, and I didn't. So it wasn't my direct jurisdictional issue. But the things I really liked is that we reduced jail populations and juvenile populations very significantly. The court was phenomenal. So when I was back in Washington, D.C., the Justice Department had a conference, and they brought in all these cities and said, you got to be like King County in Seattle, because they had the lowest juvenile detention populations and the lowest adult populations. That was really significant because the length of stay and the number of people in really influences the long-term quality and opportunities that a city can present. So we had an incredible court system. We had people in place on the juvenile and adult detention side that transformed the criminal justice system as no one else in the country has, and even now has.
So Tim Keck, we are just almost completely out of time, but the Stranger talks a lot about an urbanist view for Seattle. Really quickly here, what will single-family neighborhoods in the city look like if the Stranger agenda is somehow the city agenda?
Well, it's all going to be like people wearing chaps and piercings. That's the agenda. There's far too much single-family housing in Seattle. It needs to be rezoned in a major way, and it'll solve a lot of housing problems.
What would it look like? Nikkita, what do you think? What would it look like?
I mean, I think one major way that we could change that is with the ADUs and DADUs, making sure that there are detached and attached units. But, I agree. We have too much single-family zoned housing in the city of Seattle, which means there are not enough places to build, but for the places that we've deemed acceptable for high rises and lots of luxury apartments, which usually includes the South End or the Central District or the CID. And so it really has to be shared equitably across the city, the sort of growth that we're seeing.
So we've been talking about Seattle's swerve to the political left with Nikkita Oliver, Ron Sims, and Tim Keck. And we'll be right back to talk about DACA with a man who battled the Trump administration in court, also a dreamer. Thank you. And we're back to discuss threats to some 18,000 DACA recipients living in our state. Recipients like Ray Corona. He's 26. He leads a group called Somos Seattle. We are Seattle. We also have Noah Purcell, Solicitor General for the state of Washington, who helped sue Donald Trump on the first travel ban and will help again on the DACA lawsuit. Ray, apologies. This is such a TV question. Tell us how you felt when you heard that Donald Trump wanted to throw out DACA recipients like yourself.
I was very angry and outraged. partly because I think the question that a lot of people are asking out in the audience is, right, why does everybody want to come here, right? But I think the question that we're not asking ourselves is, why are people willing to risk their lives, and what within our U.S. foreign policy are we doing that is pushing people to move away and to leave their countries?
No, Purcell, what is the practical meaning of this executive order for these 18,000 DACA recipients in our state? What does it mean for their lives? You know, this story sometimes slips to the background because there's so many other things going on.
Yeah. I mean, I think in the short term, tremendous uncertainty and stress for people who have been able to finally have a little bit of certainty in their lives, you know, about being able to work and being able to know that they're not going to be deported when they haven't done anything wrong. So, you know, folks whose current DACA expires before March can apply to renew it. But if yours expires after that, like Ray and I were just talking about,
right, you're September, right? We talked about this. Yeah, go ahead.
Then you're, you know, after that, you just really don't know what's going to happen, and it's. I mean, it's especially hard to know, I think, with this president and this administration, because they keep changing their minds about, you know, he said so many different things about DACA and DACA recipients. It's hard to know what he's going to do as that deadline approaches, but I think it's incredible uncertainty and stress for people.
Ray, tell us a little bit more about your own situation. You came to the United States, to Seattle, when you were 9 years old. You came with your mother and your father?
I did, yeah. My family had been living in the U.S. my dad had been living in the U.S. since before I was born. So our family actually got settled in the city of Everett. And we've been living, I grew up in Everett, graduated from high school, ended up going to UW, paid for all my schooling with scholarships, and then was, right after I received DACA in 2013, I was able to graduate and start the workforce immediately. So I stayed on and worked. My first job was as an admissions advisor for the University of Washington.
Oh, that's cool. So so you went to middle school here in the Northwest, and you went to high school and college here. Are you any less American than the folks you went to school with?
Well, I think the majority of people here would probably say not, but on paper, right, that's not necessarily apparent. And you know, under this administration, that's obviously exactly what they're trying to make clear, is that undocumented folks, undocumented youth, and our parents don't belong here. So.
Noah, tell us a little bit about the lawsuit. There's 15 states involved. All the attorney generals that are involved do happen to be Democrats. Washington, I think you said, and New York and Massachusetts are kind of the lead on it. So what's the basis of the lawsuit, and what's the likelihood you prevail? How long will it take? That kind of stuff.
Sure. Well, we have a number of claims, starting with basically that the president is making this decision for the wrong reasons, for racially motivated reasons. That if you know, roughly 80% of DACA recipients are originally from Mexico, or 80% originally from Ireland, as the Attorney General, Ferguson.
Easy on the Irish here.
Yeah, well, I'm just not. I'm a quarter Irish. Nothing against the Irish, but if it were 80% Irish, would he be making this decision? Almost certainly not. So that's one of our claims. We're also arguing that it violates the Administrative Procedure Act, that this is an arbitrary and capricious decision, and it was made without going through the proper procedures. And so we have a number of claims. In terms of timing, we certainly hope to get a resolution before March, when he said that he's going to actually, you know, end the program altogether. But there's a lot to be played out in the courts, so you know, there's no telling for sure. And you know, best case scenario, Congress reaches some sort of resolution before that actually gives folks protections, you know, folks like Ray, and you know, that's what Congress is supposed to do. But if not, you know, hopefully we'll get a resolution in our case that protects people.
Ray, have you thought about going back to Mexico? What would you do? How would it be for you? You're gay. Would there be issues about that there?
I am originally from Mexico City, so the city, as many people have pointed out before, are pretty liberal areas. So not necessarily in that aspect, but that's not a question that I'm willing to really ask myself or consider, right? The fact of the matter is,
you're not willing to leave.
I'm not leaving voluntarily, no. Oh. And if somebody, thank you. If somebody wants to deport me, then you know, I mean, they can try, right? And I really hope that the community that's here and the community that are watching, right, really stands behind, because this is beyond undocumented youth and dreamers, as we know, right? Many of us. This is about our families, and this is about the close to 11 million undocumented people that are living in the U.S. So,
but some people are, in fact, right now being deported. Do you know some of these folks? Do they have, LGBTQ issues? What are folks facing that you're familiar with, that you're working on?
Yeah, I mean, deportations have been at the highest, right, even under President Obama. So when we talk about one of the points that Nikkita made earlier, right, is a lot of elected officials currently are more interested in party politics and appealing to their party rather than actually fixing community problems. And that's a challenge that we have in our community and within our political system that needs to be resolved.
So I want to invite the audience, if you want to ask a question, come over here to Rebecca, but we're going now to Liz Jones.
Yeah, Ray, something I wanted to ask you about, we do hear a lot in the media from DACA recipients, from dreamers, we hear from politicians. Somebody we don't hear often a lot from are the parents. We just hear them described as the ones who brought you here. So I wanted you to talk a little bit about how you and your parents talked about this over the years, or other parents have talked to their children about this, and the struggle that it's been in revisiting that decision and how it's played out in your time here.
So, believe it or not, right, most immigrants, particularly undocumented immigrants, are not people that want to be highly visible or public, right, about their lives or their status or anything. And so my parents for a long time, right, told me to stay under the radar, really, do everything that was within my power to not be visible. That includes maybe not participating in particular activities, right, that could bring visibility to me. And so over the years, I chose not to, right, follow my parents' advice.
Oh my gosh.
Because I knew.
I've never heard of that before.
Because I knew that, right, that this issue has not been resolved, right? I came to the U.S. when I was 9 years old. I'm 26. It's been, close to 17 years, close to 2 decades, right? And my life has not changed in any significant way. And thanks to DACA, right, we were able to more or less start living normally. But again, I cannot choose to stay silent. We need to resolve this issue.
Skip. I was at a conference recently where Todd Schulte, the head of Forward.us, it's a bipartisan immigration reform lobbying group, and he said he was very optimistic that something would be done by March in Congress. And his optimism was based in part by the fact that he felt there were people joining the coalition, like Orrin Hatch, a Republican conservative senator from Utah, for example. He said that he felt that there was momentum. Are you optimistic? And if a deal is made, what kind of trade-offs do you think will come along with that?
I think many of us have been very clear, right? Many of us undocumented youth who have been activists for years have been very clear about passing legislation that is clean and that does not have any funding for the wall or funding for mass deportations or funding for other senseless things, right? And I say that because, right, it's important for people to remember that majority of people who come here, my family included, right, most of us came here on a plane and overstayed our visas. So we don't need funding for a wall because that's not going to stop, illegal deportation. So we need to focus on, again, resolving the issue of people who are already here, in addition to looking at how we're not going to harm other immigrants along the way. Because I would have not been, a college graduate and have all these accomplishments on my part if I was not supported by my parents. And that's what we're saying.
And I'd just add that I think, the public, the American public, is overwhelmingly supportive of
something like 86%.
Yeah, I mean, the statistics are amazing, but it's really, Congress and the president that are the problem. And so I'm hopeful in the sense that they're supposed to be responsive, but when this president and the Congress, all controlled by Republicans, can't even agree on things that are supposed to be sort of basic Republican priorities, it's sort of troubling that it makes me less optimistic, let's put it that way.
Well, but President Trump, and you alluded to this at the beginning of our talk here, he seems kind of schizo on this because within the first day, you know, yes, this executive order is ending, you know, this program. And within like, I don't know, it seemed like 10 minutes, but that's a little fast. And I want Congress to fix this. Right. So if we're trying to read those tea leaves of what is he really up to, does that maybe give you some hope that he's kind of going, get this out of my problem area here?
I mean, I guess I'd agree that he said incredibly contradictory things about it, and that I guess that gives me hope because it means that he's open to some solution. It's not a hard position or something. It's not really a clear position at all. So, you know, and I guess I'd say, you know, when the Attorney General's office in Washington, we led an effort when President Obama tried to expand DACA and also create the DAPA program, Deferred Action for Parents. We led a group of states in opposing a lawsuit by Texas and 26 other states that was trying to knock that down. Mm-hmm. One thing that's interesting, and just a recent development, is the number of states that were threatening to sue about DACA itself is much, much less than 26. So, I mean, a bunch of those states that were suing to challenge the DACA and DAPA expansion sort of dropped off and said, no, we're not going to sue to challenge DACA itself. That's sort of beyond the pale. We support this program. And so it really got down to just basically Texas and a couple of others who were still willing to challenge DACA itself. So the continuation of the program, sorry. So it's interesting to see how the politics of this have changed over time, and there are more and more even conservative Republicans who are coming around and saying, you know, these folks did not do anything wrong. They're contributing enormously to the community. It doesn't make any sense to support them, both, you know, morally, legally, economically. Hopefully that will lead to some sort of resolution, but if not, our lawsuit is sort of a, you know, at the very least, it's hopefully a backup plan.
Audience, hi.
Hi.
Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. I was living in Boston in the 90s, and the Boston Globe did a major article about how the predecessor to ICE had quotas for who could come into this country and at what levels. And your parents, Ray, their generation, if you were from any European country, most of those numbers were in the tens of thousands. But if you were from Central America or South America or Mexico, those numbers might be in 3,500, 4,000 a year. So that's a real important thing, I would think, in thinking about how race has played out in this conversation. What I want to go back to, though, Ray, is the comment you made at the very beginning, which is how the policies of the U.S. have created an atmosphere where more people from countries are being displaced, are coming here, and now are being told they have no place to be. Would you say more about that, please?
You know, I'm by no means an expert on foreign policy, so, you know, I definitely want to give that question back to, you know, somebody who maybe not today, and that's a really complex conversation that I think we ought to have. I don't know that we have enough time today, though, but I want to definitely make a point, and the point is, you know, if legislation was to happen today, right, if the DREAM Act passed or some sort of piece of legislation protecting myself or other undocumented people and had included a pathway to citizenship, I will not be a citizen until like 10 years from now, at least, at minimum of a decade from now. And so it's important, I say that because, you know, a lot of people, right, especially a lot of conservative folks think that getting in the back of the line or becoming legal is as easy as ordering an Uber, right? And that's not the case. Like, you know, we have to understand that there's a process, and our immigration system is extremely outdated and does not, right, it doesn't provide solutions, you know, for the world that we live in today.
I think people are surprised how slow, how many years it does take.
I didn't say that, but my family actually, my dad actually filed for his residency back in 2001. Again, that was before we got here. He's been waiting basically, you know, almost 2 decades.
Yeah, a question for Noah, but Ray, it's relevant to you too, so feel free to jump in. But about the lawsuit, you know, one thing that came up when your boss, A.G. Ferguson, announced this, he looked at the information that the DACA recipients provided to the government when they applied for this program. They gave their names, their parents' names, their home addresses, where their parents work, all this personal information that's out there. And Department of Homeland Security has said on their website, you know, we do not proactively turn this over to ICE for immigration enforcement. but the policies can change. They say that on their website. But I wanted to ask you, what leads you to believe this information is really vulnerable, and how will the lawsuit address that?
Yeah.
Well, the main concern is just that the administration has not said very clearly that they're not going to use, they haven't said as clearly as we would like that they're not going to use it for enforcement purposes. And at the very least, I guess basically our lawsuit is asking, at the very least, you should promise that you're not going to use this information that people provided in good faith in response to a government program you should not use it against them. And so that's sort of the bare minimum of what we're asking for, that people get at least that assurance, so they know that by coming out of the shadows, by applying to have a protected status to work legally, they're not being punished for that. And hopefully at the very least we'll be able to secure that.
Is there any plans from the states for suing around DAPA and for the parents? So even if DACA is renewed, there's still risk for your family to be broken up. And so I'm wondering, is there plans for that? And then also, what solutions would you like to see to protect your parents?
In terms of what solutions, again, a pathway to citizenship would be nice, not only for myself, but for the other 11 million people that are living in the U.S. Again, these are people that by no means just got here yesterday. These are people that have set up lives, businesses, and are really ingrained within our communities, right? And so oftentimes, right, when we talk about passing any sort of legislation, oftentimes we see the southern border being portrayed and people somehow crossing the border multiple times, and that's not necessarily that does happen, but that's not what we're looking at today.
So, did you want to add something?
Well, I was just going to say, in terms of the legal options, unfortunately, that ship has sort of sailed, because President Obama tried to create the DAPA program for parents. 26 states sued, saying it was illegal. They sued in Texas. They won narrowly, and then won on appeal in the Fifth Circuit, and then they went to the Supreme Court, and it tied 4-4 whether that ruling was correct. And so the Fifth Circuit ruling was upheld, and Washington led an effort of a bunch of states on the side of the administration, arguing this is legal, this actually benefits states, you should not be blocking this from happening. But unfortunately, the Supreme Court was tied 4-4, and so there's not much more that can be done about that right now. That case is
So when we talk about DACA, we always talk about the recipients as, they were brought here as children. It would be interesting, I think, to talk about what age some of these folks are now, because everyone thinks they're, kids or teenagers, but they're not. So just who are the clients here? Who are these DACA recipients? Roughly what age are they? Noah, do you have that from the lawsuit?
A range of ages. A lot are students at public colleges and universities in Washington. A lot are people like Ray, recent grads who are out working. The exact ages. You had to have been under 16 when you arrived here to qualify, and you had to arrive before 2007, if I'm recalling correctly. I'm not very good at doing math on the fly, but anyway, these folks would range from.
General, right?
I know. Well, right? They told me there would be no math in law school. That is not part of the job description.
Little math test at the end of the day.
But the bottom line is, early, late teens, early to early 30s, I think, basically.
Now it's 25.
Oh,
yes.
Average.
Right,
yeah.
so you're right in there. So the emotional argument that you often hear is, these folks were brought here as children, so they live here through no fault of their own. That's a great emotional argument. Does it translate as a legal argument? Does it work, in courtrooms?
Well, that's not, that aspect is not sort of central to our legal argument that they were brought here through no fault of our own. I think that goes through no fault of their own. That goes through, I guess it mostly goes to sort of the equities of the case. It's not part of our, it's not a central part of our case. It's just except the idea that, why is the president targeting these folks who really did nothing wrong, who are contributing enormously? And we have in our case, I'm not a math person, but there are declarations. There's a great team in our office working on this case. There are declarations from economists, from a wide range of experts about how the DACA program has benefited states economically, has benefited the country economically, has, when people can work legally, they can get better jobs, they can, they're fully in sort of the tax system and such, and not that folks who don't pay taxes, because often they do, but they can work better jobs, earn more money, support their families, and it's better for everyone.
And if I can answer about that question, because to me that's a talking point, right? The majority of elected officials just use.
They just say it over and over, and that's yes.
And that, I mean that happened from the first time that the DREAM Act was introduced, and that was in 2001, if I'm not mistaken. And so that's something that is slightly outdated, right? And that many of us are saying again, many of us dreamers, which a lot of us don't like to call ourselves that, because that's
how come?
I would say it's a really privileged term, and to some level of degree, it implies that you have some sort of college education and are, a top.
Because of the way the DREAM Act, Noah explained this to me, the way the DREAM Act is in the state of Washington,
right.
It's about college.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, but again, it's really about promoting the stereotype of the model immigrant, right? And that's why many of us are shying away from utilizing that term and shying away from, again, blaming our parents for bringing us here, because that's, at the end of the day, again, to me, it's about what policies have been implemented globally, right, that have made this migration happen.
I've talked to people who, immigrants and guest workers who have expressed some resentment toward DACA recipients in the sense that feel they're getting special treatment, that they're people who are waiting years and years to hear about changes to their status or citizenship and that kind of thing. How do you respond to that? Have you encountered some tension within the community of immigrants, and how would you respond to people who have those feelings?
I said it earlier today, and again, our system is out of date, right, and needs to be revamped extremely, right? The number of immigration judges that are actually practicing are very few, which is why the cases take a long time to resolve, and so we need to fix that. And in terms of getting special treatment, again, that was something that that politicians and elected officials did, right, as a way to to be able to pass other sort of legislation, right, and utilize oftentimes immigrants and immigrant youth, right, as pawns for those types of political maneuverings. So, as I would say, many of us who are, I consider myself an activist, and I call myself undocumented, even though I'm a DACA recipient, and so I'm right there with them, right? I think we need to continue, mobilizing people not only here in the city of Seattle, but across our state and really across the country to ensure that and to hold people accountable to provide solutions to this issue, not only for us as DACA recipients, but for the 11 million.
We have time for a tight question, very tight.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Tennille Cato. I was a candidate of mayor of Seattle and now an applicant for City Council position 8. And forgive me ahead of time if I'm a little off agenda. I just got here, but it is my understanding that...
A tight question to the point.
It is my understanding that you are against the Nazi Gestapo principles that Trump is doing when it comes to standing up for universal human rights. Is that correct to a certain extent? So my question is to everyone that is in here. As an example, in Seattle, Washington, I'm just trying to figure out why we're punishing people in our own city when we are trespassing them just for expressing an opposite opinion, like Alex Zimmerman that's standing outside because he can't come in, just by having an opposite opinion. So I'm just wondering, what do you feel
I feel like you're not...
I'm asking him a question. How do you feel about punishing people for speaking up for their universal human right? Because it's similar to the Nazi Gestapo principle that Trump is using when it comes to the subject that you're speaking about today.
Real tight.
I agree that the president has some seriously troubling tendencies. I think one thing that's been, people have strong feelings about immigration issues, and I do think that one thing that's been actually good about this conversation is that a lot of people who didn't pay any attention to immigration policy before at all have actually learned a fair amount, I think, through some of the, frankly, terrible things the president has done. They've learned about,
He's a walking civics lesson.
Well, I mean, in some ways, I think people learned a lot from watching some of the human stories that came out in the travel ban litigation, for example. I think people have learned a lot from watching the human stories that have come out since he's made these announcements about DACA. So although I disagree enormously with his policy decisions, I do think that people are actually, I hope, people are learning something about the people who are affected and how heartless a lot of these policies are.
So before we run out of time, Ray, the one thing I feel like we didn't get to, the plight of DACA recipients who may or may not be renewed, who are LGBTQ, who are maybe being sent back to places that aren't as hip or cool as Mexico City. What do you know about that, and what are the dangers that some of these folks are actually facing?
Well, you know, it's known that there's an estimate of 267,000 LGBTQ undocumented immigrants overall. Not necessarily DACA recipients, but these are overall undocumented immigrants. Yeah. And so, you know, when somebody who's LGBTQ and undocumented gets put into deportation proceedings, and as they are stopped in the detention center, oftentimes they're held in solitary confinement, right? And as anybody knows, right, that humans are living beings and they like to connect socially with others. And so oftentimes solitary confinement brings up a lot of other issues. And, you know, in terms of their rights being respected within these detention centers, they are not.
So, Noah, I wanted to know what you think the likelihood of Congress doing something now. If you think about it, they've been talking about doing something about this for a very, very long time. But do deadlines force behaviher? Right. What do you think about that?
You know, it's hard to put numbers on.
There's a bill Succeed that's been mentioned. I mean, it's a very long rollout.
The hard thing to know, I mean, I think another difficult thing about this president is it's so hard to know what he supports and what he doesn't, right? I mean, he says one day he has a deal with Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi, and then, you know, they announce it, and then he says, no, there was no agreement, or it also included a wall. So, you know, it's just very hard to predict. And I mean, if I could also just, I do think that one other thing, on the note of sort of Seattle and part of what makes Seattle a good place, I mean, one thing that is wonderful about Seattle is that we have a lot of organizations here that are able to help individual immigrants, like Northwest Immigrant Rights Project, that help, because one of the other things that's worth mentioning is that, you know, a lot of folks who get into deportation proceedings, if they have a lawyer, you know, there might be a lot of arguments available to them. Like if they're going to be in danger if they're returned to their home country, they might have some arguments. But if they don't have a lawyer to help them with any of that, they're probably not going to be able to make any of those arguments oftentimes. And so I guess I just want to give sort of a call out to the Northwest Immigrant Rights Project and some of the other organizations around Seattle that help folks, you know, help individuals who are going through deportation proceedings, regardless of, you know, whether they're DACA recipients or not.
We could keep talking about this for a long time. We've been talking with Ray Corona, DACA recipient, and Noah Purcell, Solicitor General for the state of Washington. We're coming back next month when we host Mayor for 2 months, Tim Burgess. Thank you.